Okay, hey everyone. Starting a new module, new unit. We're turning some big corners, historically speaking, conceptually speaking. So this week we're talking about sort of the postmodern turn, and we are looking at a chapter from this book, not this particular edition. This is the first edition. Our reading selection comes out of the revised second edition. And Barry Brummett is our rhetorician today, this week. And I have lots to say here. This is kind of like a strangely emotional reading and set of topics for me, and I'll explain why. So this one here, this first edition, was published in 1994. And it was right around then, I think it was 95, maybe 95-ish, 96, when I was very first learning about rhetoric as an English major at the University of Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. No one's heard of it, tiny little university. But I got a good education as an English major, and in the last couple of semesters, I actually discovered for the first time this business of rhetoric in an English department. And this was the second class in rhetoric that I took, which was the Rhetoric of Popular Culture. And this is one of the books that we used. I had taken one class in rhetoric where we talked kind of about basic stuff, fundamental stuff, Aristotle, some of the big essays of the 20th century, Bitzer's Rhetorical Situation, and so on. And I was absolutely stunned by these ideas that felt so rich and relevant. And when I took this class, that was it. This book and this class kind of sealed my future as a professional, as a scholar, as someone who decided that this is it. This is what I want to do. So it's really not too much of an exaggeration to say that Brummett's Rhetoric of Popular Culture book, but not only just his book, it was like everything else that we were doing that semester. We were reading stuff by John Fiske and so on, and it was all just kind of blowing my mind. So to me, this is really kind of like revisiting the very thing that got me, going on this path of my entire life, my life's work. So it's pretty wild. So, and the other thing that I'm kind of reckoning with here is just how far removed from these ideas the field is, how far we've kind of drifted away from what was going on here. So I think I have another video where I give the kind of the postmodern context, and up until this point in the semester we've been talking, or at least in the 20th century we've been talking about argumentation with Perelman and Toulmin, right? And that was really important because that was still kind of connected to the ideas about reason that were dominant in the modern period. Then this guy Kenneth Burke comes along and starts to kind of mess things up and expand our conception of what rhetoric can be to include things like literature and poems and plays and images and narratives and stories and on and on. And Burke was a really deep and nuanced thinker of how rhetoric operates. And basically, because of his kind of impact on the field, maybe we would have gone this way anyway, but the story of rhetoric throughout the 20th century, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, was really about how it was pushing out away from the oral and the sort of explicitly political, right? Like presidential speeches or debates or, campaign type stuff, right? That is, in the early half of the first half of the 20th century, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when the field was kind of taking shape around rhetorical criticism, it was really just still focused on political speeches, political oratory. And, I came into the field again at around the late 90s. There was still this sense from my professors at the time, most of whom were men, although Jennifer McLennan was the one who taught me rhetoric in the English department. And she was wonderful. I miss my time with Dr. McLennan, and I hope she's well. I'm not too sure what she's up to, but she was awesome, and she got me sent down this road. I ended up writing a paper on Dennis Rodman, the basketball player, in this class, and it just kind of it was the greatest time. So, excuse me. to get back to the story here, what was going on in terms of rhetoric in this sort of time period was that it was starting to push into newer and more what they say cohidian, or more normal, more kind of ordinary dimensions or aspects of everyday life, right? And so like up until, you know, the 80s and 90s even, rhetoric scholars weren't really talking about television shows or movies or literature that much. There was still that kind of focus on political oratory, right? But I had taken a class in rhetoric of popular culture, and so I was one of these new generation of young rhetoric scholars who wanted to study the popular, right? So even to study the popular back in the like late 90s, early 2000s kind of area was a little controversial, because film, advertisements, television shows, God forbid, like cartoons or comic books or video games, we didn't really even have that back then. All of that was deemed low. All of that was deemed to be trivial and insignificant. And that's what people do when they're just being silly and irrational, and it's leisure activity. And the popular was just like, we don't go there. We are scholars. We are serious. We look at serious things. And for many, for several decades in the middle to later part of the 20th century, rhetoricians were obsessively trying to distinguish what it is that we do from the sciences. We had this kind of social science-y, like angst hangover, like we should be more like them, but we don't want to be, but like, what do we do that's different? So there was a lot of that kind of discussion around this time period of like 80s and 90s. So rhetoric is pushing into new domains, looking at new things as counting as rhetorical. And this intersects a lot with this other stuff called cultural studies, which is a related field of study to rhetoric. It's sort of part of communication, it's part of media, it's a little bit more interested in culture itself and not just sort of language and persuasive discourse necessarily, but there's a lot of overlap between rhetoric and cultural studies, and I am in that space, again, largely because of this Rhetoric of Popular Culture class in this book. So that's a bit of a lengthy intro, but I actually don't have like a ton to say about this reading, and I do apologize. I know it's longer than we all would want it to be. None of these chapters are particularly short, and I've been looking for weeks, actually, to try to find something that is tighter and shorter, but still kind of says the things that I want us to cover, and I haven't found it. So I decided, what the heck, I'll copy the whole chapter, and I'll just sort of talk about the key parts. So I will probably, send out some kind of message just to say, you don't need to read this whole chapter. Not everything is, needs to be known or understood, and I will draw your attention to the key parts. There's just a handful, but they're important, right? And so what I want us to how I want us to situate this is as a kind of historical artifact where rhetoric was being conceptualized in a certain way at a certain time. This is, again, latter couple of decades of the 20th century, and how it is that rhetoric was starting to move into more popular and more cultural kinds of practices and domains, and the ways that we were talking about all of that and how it was rhetorical and why it mattered and so on, right? So this reading is significant, again, because it is illustrating this moment where rhetorical scholars were starting to go more in the direction of cultural studies kind of stuff and looking at everyday stuff, looking at popular stuff, looking at non-serious kind of stuff. And there was, at the time, this need to defend these moves, right? So when I was writing about film or whatever I was writing about, even like popular literature type stuff, you have to kind of, back then, you had to kind of justify, like, the reason this matters is because people spend so much time and investment and emotional kind of da-da-da. We don't really need to make those justifying arguments anymore. I think everyone's sort of on the same page. But it's interesting looking back just a couple of decades to see how much effort was needed to go into the defense. This whole book is a defense and justification of how and why it is that rhetoric scholars should look at popular culture, right? So Now, the other thing I want to say about this book, which is, again, part of the reason why we don't need to get too worked up about this, is that this is a book that is assigned in a rhetorical criticism class. This chapter, Rhetorical Methods in Critical Studies. This is about how to do rhetorical criticism, which we are not learning how to do in this class. Okay, so what we are looking at here is, again, a kind of historical artifact, a species of this discussion up at the time about, the fact that rhetoric can be found in all these different everyday popular kinds of locations, and TV screens, and in magazines, and even fashion. Clothing, attire, and all this kind of stuff matters, right? And I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, so we had to defend this move. We had to defend it, and this is the way to study it. So, this business of criticism, right? So, criticism is a class that I've taught a number of times. I haven't done it at the undergrad level in a little while, but we offer it still. It's still something that we do, right? So how do you read rhetoric? How do you analyze rhetoric out there in the wild? Again, if you came into the field when I did, largely you were still looking at speeches and debates and social movement type stuff and oratory and campaign kind of stuff, standard political oratory. But how do you study this other stuff? How do you study a film from a rhetorical perspective? How do you study, an advertisement? How do you study visuals, right? This was all to come. And Brummett's work, and by the way, I should also note that Barry Brummett is a scholar I greatly admire. He's written a number of books sort of like this one, on style, on machine aesthetics, on homologies, he's written a bunch, and he's written a bunch of really awesome criticism. He's a really great critic, and he's a pretty good theorist of critic, and he's written a bunch of really good kind of accessible texts on how to do all this kind of stuff. And so I just want to acknowledge the work of Barry Brummett, and I've met a lot of people in the field who have come before me and who I admire, and sadly I don't think I've met Barry Brummett personally, but I really, I'm a student of his work and what he was doing back then, and I followed him for years, and so it's nice for me to kind of go back and revisit, for me, what kind of kicked it all off. All right, so like I said, I only want to focus on a couple of things here, because we are not doing rhetorical criticism in this class, but it's interesting for us to see, as kind of students of the history and the sweep of ideas about rhetoric, that in the latter part of the 20th century, rhetorical critics, rhetorical scholars who are interested in analyzing and critiquing the practices of rhetoric out there in society were moving into this realm of the popular, and this is one of the best kind of treatments of how to do that and what's involved. So the first thing is this business of texts and meanings. Again, the distance that we've traveled from this is pretty significant, because honestly, we don't really even talk about texts in rhetoric that much anymore, right? But back then, this was a key moment, because this was the moment that rhetoric scholars were talking about texts. That's it. That's what we were looking at as scholars, as critics. We're looking at text. So we could call a speech a text, right? Obama's, DNC speech from 2004 or whatever it was, right? There's a text. You could look at the transcript, or you could look at a recording of it, and it's bounded in time and space, and it's there it is, right? But we can also talk about a commercial, an advertisement, as being a text, or we can talk about the halftime show at the Super Bowl as a text, right? Or we can talk about a movie, which we have many, many times, or on and on and on, right? A performance, a live performance, an event, maybe a demonstration or some kind of scuffle, or, there's scholars in my field who do stuff on even David Gruber in my department. My pal, David Gruber, has a book called Splat, where he's interested in how it is that citizens throw things at political leaders. Splat! Like throwing, pies and glitter or whatever, right? So these even events or performances can be thought of as text. So number one is how it is that rhetoric scholars and critics back in this time period were thinking about rhetoric through textuality. And that was the main language that we used at that time, is what is your text? What is your text? I've taught criticism a bunch of times. What is your text? The other word we use is artifact, right? So if it's a less verbal kind of a thing, like a sweater or a shirt or a costume, you can talk about an artifact, which again is a kind of an object, which conveys rhetorical meaning and significance. All right, so the textuality, right? So what is your text? What is your text? The other word we use is artifact, right? So if it's a less verbal kind of a thing, like a sweater or a shirt or a costume, you can talk about an artifact, which again is a kind of an object which conveys rhetorical meaning and significance. All right, so on page 92 there, the heading is Texts Influenced Through Meanings, right? So back then we were interested in texts and we were interested in meanings. The other thing we don't really talk that much about anymore is meaning, right? What is a meaning? Why do we care about meanings? Well, if we're interested in text, then we're interested in what texts are saying or what they are communicating or what the message is, right? So meaning was really important in terms of this is what a text is. Sorry, popped up there. I had a pop up. This idea that this is what a text wants you to think. This is what this speaker wants you to think, right? Or this is what this movie is trying to say. Or here's the meaning of this movie. Here's the meaning of this ad. And the thing that really blew my mind when I was first learning about these ideas, this notion that you could have a kind of surface meaning and a latent or a hidden meaning, right? There's more meanings that can go into a text that you can find in a text. And I was like obsessed with this idea of like rhetoric scholars are like meaning whisperers and we're coaxing the real true meanings out of text and we're finding things that other people can't see. That's part of it, right? And he even says at one point that meaning is like, you know, it's complex, it's many layered, it's sometimes not even fully accessible to everyone, right? But that was the kind of vocabulary of the time. Rhetoric scholars look at texts and they look for meaning in texts, right? Because the idea was creators of messages encode meaning into texts, and then audiences receive and decode those meanings. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one thing. It's not like I'm encoding purple, blue, and yellow, and your job is to decode purple, blue, and yellow, because sometimes you can decode green, pink, and orange, right? And so what's going on there? Why is it that audiences are taking away different meanings from texts and doing different things with this was the action at this time, right? It's like there was so much like concern when big movies came out and Oscar-winning movies, something like Dances with Wolves was a big one back around this time. That Kevin Costner movie on the frontier and the Native Americans and all of that. And it was just this like, yay, everyone loved Dances with Wolves, but you could perform a rhetorical analysis of the meanings of that, and you could do deep analyses of the significations and the symbolisms and on and on and on. The reason this worked well for me is because I was an English major, and so for like 3 or 4 years I had been analyzing texts, poems and short stories, and I was very good at like plunging into a text and generating interpretations and possible meanings. And so I merged nicely into this new way of thinking about rhetoric as kind of popular and artifactual and textual, because it's now just reading into movies and reading into an album or reading into a lyric to a song or whatever, right? And so this is where I got my start, is sort of like decoding meanings and coming up with interpretations of texts. All right, so 93, this idea of texts are sites of struggle over meaning. That phrase, texts are sites of struggle, was one that I heard seemingly infinitely at this time, right? So again, message producers encode meanings, and then audiences take those meanings and do different things with them. And that's sort of the whole point of this struggle business, right? And I remember Jennifer McClendon, back when I took these classes as an undergrad, I still remember one time she said something about like, more important than the debate, than the political debate, is what comes after, right? You have the spinning heads, the talking heads, the interpreters, the media analysts. The way that they spin things and interpret things and derive meaning out of the debate is almost more important than the debate itself, right? And that was like, holy cow, you're right. Rhetorical critics matter because we're the ones who are kind of interpreting and deciding the meanings of things and trying to, send that out. But there can be struggle over meanings, meaning that like we can disagree with what's going on, or we can find alternative meanings in texts, and so there was this whole language also of oppositional readings, today we're familiar with this phrase of hate watching, right? Or like hate watch. What is a hate watch? Well, it's like, I know I don't like this, but I'm watching it purposefully to not like this, right? That is a text as a site of struggle. You're struggling over the text. You're watching it even while you're angry that you're watching it, right? And so this business of texts as sites of struggle over meanings, where producers of messages and receivers of messages are constantly kind of battling, and they're battling up here in terms of like what they're taking away and what I'm trying to communicate versus what I'm pulling out of it. The work of John Fiske in cultural studies was really important influence on this kind of stuff. John Fiske was interested in like fashion, right? And so you think about, I remember ripped jeans came in the 80s, and we were like, my generation was the one that started ripping jeans, literally buying jeans and then like shredding them. And I remember in this class talking about the kind of resistant sort of struggles that people, users, consumers, everyday, members of society engage in to own their meanings or to resist dominant kind of encodings, right? It's like, we're going to rip our jeans, or we're going to wear our pants low, or we're going to, have our collars sticking out, or our the tag sticking out, or whatever. We're messing around. We're playing with meaning. We're playing with codes. We're resisting the things that are handed to us, or we're reworking them and remaking them and turning them into our own, right? And so this idea of fashion as a site of struggle, as a site of resistance, as the place where you are expressing your freedom and dissociation from those practices, those meanings, those identities. This was the realm of rhetorical action, all right? So that already covers like a huge amount of what we're doing here, and I'm at 20 minutes, so let me speed up. So 95, he's talking again about criticism, and he says basically the critic of popular culture needs two things, an attitude and a method. We're not going to be bothered with the method stuff here, but the attitude stuff's interesting. We can kind of take away this part. What kind of an attitude? Well, on the next page he says, a refusal to take things at face value. Again, what else is going on in this text? What other meanings can we pull out of it or find? How can we find meanings in a text and use that against the text or against the authors, right? I bet you didn't know this was in there. Ha ha, right? So don't take things at face value. Look deeper, look beyond. And then he uses the word suspicion. Always looking beneath the surface here. Now, we need to be careful here, because I go onto Twitter these days just because I'm trying to stay on top of like what's going on here, but it's painful, right? The amount of conspiracy thinking, the amount of constant looking for some transcendent truth, reality behind every little, this doesn't look right. So many people on Twitter, what's going on in this video? Why is that like that? Why? That to me is not what he's talking about here. That's paranoia. That is an insistent on finding some kind of alternative reality. He's talking about a kind of healthy democratic suspicion of appearances, going back to Plato, right? It's like, we probably shouldn't accept everything at face value. That's just the attitude that we're talking about here. All right. 101 talking about concerns over power. I think this is probably pretty innate for us at this point, right? That power moves through society, it moves through mediums, it moves through commerce, it moves through fashion, it moves through narratives, it moves through everything, right? And so rhetorical critics need to be kind of attentive to how power is moving through the texts that create the meanings and so on and so on. You get it, right? So critical interventionism is this idea that what critics do, again, I think we should all be comfortable with this idea, is that critics intervene, right? They step in and they say, oh, hold on a sec. I don't know if anyone's aware of what's really going on in this movie here, and so there's an intervention. There's we're trying to improve things. We're trying to call out abuses of power, or we're trying to point out, bad meanings or homogenous meanings, or, just like obnoxious patterns or whatever. Now, the stuff that kicks in on 106 on these continuums are interesting, but don't sweat it too much. But the basic idea here is when we're, again, this is for criticism. If we're doing criticism, then this stuff is a lot more helpful, because it's like, all right, well, how do I find a text? If I'm interested in analyzing a text, what counts? How do I do this? So this is all helpful in terms of selecting texts or artifacts for a critical analysis. So you can talk about discrete, which is like bounded, or diffuse, which is more like this, right? So that Mike Tyson fight the other night, that was a fairly discrete event, but you could also talk about Jake Paul, this character, and how he goes back to YouTube and he's done all this kind of stuff. So Jake Paul, if you wanted to look at him, you could look at a more diffuse history, right? It really comes down to how you're drawing your boundaries around the thing you want to talk about, and what matters in terms of context, in terms of the relevant rhetorical activity. But again, don't stress too much. The source of meaning, skippity skip, context. Again, this is what we do as rhetorical critics, is we think about texts within a certain context. Why is it that this Tyson fight was so enthralling? Well, you had the generation from, the great boxer from previous generation, and this new generation's clown, and there's generation spanning interest. It's a bit of a clown show. It's a bit of a gong show. Like, a lot of things going on contextually and so on, right? So the fourth continuum, context text relationship on Wart 14. Again, we don't need to know this stuff, but it's interesting to see how rhetoric was being talked about in terms of where to find it, how to locate it. All right. The last thing really I want us to sort of look at, notice how much I'm skipping over here, because again, this is deeper than we need, but this business of subject positions on 129. So we're skipping over a bunch, and then we're landing on subject positions. I'm actually writing an essay right now. It's weird. It's like I'm revisiting, basically the book that characterized my entire adult life. And meanwhile, I'm writing an essay with a graduate student right now that's actually talking about subject positions and the language in this time period of subject positions in relationship to texts, right? So we have a movie, we have a TV series, we have a magazine ad or a billboard or whatever. So that's our text, whatever text we're choosing. And then we think about the audience for that text. And the idea is that there's a gap, there's a space between the billboard and the viewer. There's a space between the screen where the movie is and the audience, right? There's a literal space. I'm calling this in this paper the hermeneutic space of interpretation. And so you've got the text and you've got the subject, and the subject inhabits a certain position, right? So the idea of a subject position is the text is encoding certain meanings that are asking you to assume a certain kind of subjectivity, a certain kind of, sense of self, right? And maybe it's a more aggressive sense of self, or maybe it's a more patriotic sense of self, or maybe it's a more family-oriented sense of self, maybe it's a more selfless sense of self, on and on and on, right? What the message is inviting you to assume a certain kind of reality, a certain kind of truth. We talk about that as a subject position, right? And again, because audiences and readers and users or wearers of clothes or whatever, they have agency. They have the ability to interpret text, and these sites of struggles business kicks in. And so we can talk about the subject position as a sympathetic subject position. I agree with this text. I see myself. I affirm it. We can talk about an oppositional subject position. Or we can talk about an ironic or a negotiating subject position. The second one, the oppositional subject position. So I don't know if you guys, going back a bit, but that movie Wedding Crashers was a pretty big movie back, grad school or around there. And it was a very popular movie, made a ton of money, but you can watch it today and see a lot of misogyny and even homophobia, right? But it's funny, there's some good comedy and good acting and whatever. And so it did very well. But I remember I went with my girlfriend at the time, and we were with another couple. And my girlfriend and her friend Molly were sitting in their seats in the theater watching this movie. And at a certain point, they started laughing and they started kind of chuckling to each other. And I could tell that they were rolling their eyes and getting all pissed off. And they were struggling as women, as feminists. They were struggling with the codes on the screen about men who are conquering women and this gay character who's a total freak. And it's and they were getting disgusted by this movie. And so they started resisting the interpretation. They started resisting the coding and the messaging of this thing. And so they were inhabiting a subject position of opposition to that thing. And even though it was a little annoying in the moment because they were being kind of loud and unruly, I'm kind of like, I look back on that and I'm like, yeah, they were doing exactly what like Brummett is talking about here. They were resisting, they were opposing. But you can also take ironic, kind of take parts of it, of a text that you like and leave the other parts. There's a lot of things that audiences can do. Sorry, this is a long one, but there's a good amount of stuff to cover here in terms of the moment, the historical moment, and I'm done going through the reading here. So those are the ideas. Text as sites of struggle, what it is that criticism was about or up to back, 30 years ago or whatever, and this business of the subject positions and, what is a text, and this idea of resistance, and on and on and on. So again, there's a lot more information in this reading than we need to worry about, but it's Barry Brummett, so you're welcome. It's a little extra sauce for you to enjoy. All right, so I'll shut up there, and we will continue on with our next set of readings. Hope everyone's well. Peace.